Okay, I hope everybody had enough coffee. Many aspects of evolutionary theory and processes remain enigmatic, and sex is one of them. Or as our next speaker's words, Lilach Hadany, said, the evolution of sex is a tough riddle. If the purpose of reproduction is to propagate genes, what would anyone share its genes with somebody else in the progeny? And why aren't we all reproducing by cloning ourselves? It would be nice to have me and my clone in the faculty. We're going to have 2 votes for every issue. So our next speaker will present hopefully a solution to this fascinating mode of selection, sexual selection. And as I said, this is Dr. Lilach Hadany, and the title is The Role of Stress in Evolution, but no, do not mistake, this is going to be about sexual selection and stress and evolution. So please.
Thank you. It is a particular honor and pleasure for me to speak in this forum. It is a particular honor and pleasure for me to speak in this forum, as this is not only a celebration for evolution people around here, but especially for the ones who happen to know Mark. And I've been privileged to do my postdoctoral studies with Mark many years ago, and many of the works I'm doing today are still rooted in this period. So I would like, do everybody hear me? I'll try. No way to take it with me, right?
No, I don't think you can take it with you, but maybe I can.
I'll try to do it. And if you don't hear me, the people at the back just wave. So I would like to speak about the evolution of the evolutionary process. In particular, on the evolution of the mechanisms that generate genetic variation. Most notably sexual reproduction, but also a bit about other mechanisms. And there is a basic paradox with variation. If we have an individual that survived in the current generation, why should it risk and have its offspring genotype different than its own? It has an indication that it survived. Why should it go for anything else? And on the other hand, if we have a species with no genetic variation at all, no evolution would happen, and this species is doomed. So we have a paradox between these 2 forces, and I would like to take the perspective of the gene, the gene that affects variation. This gene is currently linked to a certain genetic background, and this genetic background affects the fitness. Now, if this gene is linked to a good genetic background, then it would be a good idea to keep the genome as similar to the current as possible. But if it is linked to a maladapted genome, then it would be a good idea to change it or to move to a different background. But then, how can a gene have any idea about whether this genetic background is good or not? This could go through stress responses. The individual has some indications if it is maladapted to the current environment, and we could predict that the genes that regulate genetic variation would induce more variation when things are bad, when the individual is feeling bad. So we would try this kind of simplified modifier that induces high variation when stressed and low variation when feeling well. And we'll see how this might affect classical evolutionary theory. And in particular, one of the most exciting questions in evolution, and that's the evolution of sex and recombination. And the problem can be described in the following way. If we consider a female, say an average female in a sexual population, it would have on average 2 offspring, each of them carrying half of her genome. So the frequency of our genome does not change significantly from one generation to the next. And 4 grand offspring, each of them carrying a quarter of a genome. Now, if within this population we have a mutant, asexual female, it would produce 2 copies of herself, each carrying her entire genome, and then 4 grand offspring, each carrying her entire genome, and everything else being equal, we would expect such asexual mutation to take over the population rapidly. And in fact, the problem can be seen as if we have populations reproducing sexually, once in a while, possibly once in a long while, an asexual mutant would appear, and we would expect it to take over the population unless something quite strong is happening. But from first looking at it, it seems that the situation is actually harder. Not only that sex does not have immediate advantages, it has rather immediate costs. First, we need to find mates or attract pollinators. All this investment is in order to be able to mix half of the genotype of the offspring with someone else. There is the problem of destruction of favorable gene combinations that have been generated by selection. And then we have the possibility of disease, potential conflicts. It seems that sex would be really rare in the world, but there is one major empirical evidence that most organisms reproduce sexually at least a little bit of the time, definitely most higher eukaryotes. And one of the more complicated cases is the one of facultative sexuals. These are organisms in various groups that can reproduce either sexually or asexually. And this means that at every generation, they have the option to switch to asexual reproduction. Now here, we cannot count on the long-term advantages of a population reproducing sexually, but we need to explain how can sexual reproduction be maintained in the short term, when you always have an alternative. So one option suggested by people is direct benefits. If the females get some significant advantages from the males, this can help a lot. If the males build nests, gather food, help with the offspring, get up in the night. But in many sexual species, the males do not help at all and contribute only their genes to the females. So we need to go to genetic advantages, and many of the solutions suggested to this question over something like 80 years include either deleterious mutations or adaptation events, or the combination of deleterious mutations and adaptation events, where under these conditions, sexual reproduction can be advantageous, but the conditions are quite tough. It means that we would expect to find sexual reproduction in the world, but not that it would be as abundant as we see it. We wouldn't expect to see it everywhere, but in rather limited groups. And I would like to offer 2 levels of solutions to this problem. One is about the switch from asexual to facultatively sexual and the maintenance of facultative sexuals for a long time. And the second is with the even harder problem of obligatory sexual reproduction. How come that some organisms actually reproduce sexually all the time? And we take the point of view of the gene again, and we ask, this gene affects sexual reproduction. Is it a good time to pay the cost of sex and move to a different genetic background? And the answer should depend on the current genetic background. Would it actually work? So the most basic model, we can take a model of 2 loci, one affecting the fitness, one affecting the reproduction strategy, where U is for uniform sexual reproduction and C for condition-dependent sex. And sex is costly. we can describe the changes in the frequencies of genotypes from one generation to the next through mutation, selection, and reproduction. And the equations themselves get rather complicated, but we have selection, reproduction, but either sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction, depending on one's genotype, and mutation. And quite surprisingly, this system of equation can actually be solved, and certain relatively general results can be obtained. One is that the strategy of extreme condition-dependent sex, which is reproduce sexually when you are stressed, but reproduce asexually when you are feeling good, can evolve throughout the parameter range for almost any cost of sex. And the intuition here that we call the abundant sheep principle is that if your genetic background is really bad, then it's worth to pay any cost in order to move to a different genetic background and abandon this ship. This was an analytical model. We extended it to stochastic simulations with finite population, many loci, and the important thing is that simulations and analysis completely agree. Reproduce sexually when things are bad is much more advantageous than reproducing sexually at the same rate in all times. Now, how does the cost of sex get into the picture? This is a rather important point. If less fit individuals, stressed individuals, reproduce sexually more often, and sex is costly, then they pay the cost of sex more often. This means that the cost of sex turns into part of natural selection. This means that natural selection becomes more efficient. Deleterious mutations are eliminated more rapidly, and the average fitness of the population can increase. But this is particularly effective when we are considering a situation of adaptation. When the environment has changed, then condition-dependent sex allows the good allele to take over the population much more rapidly than if sexual reproduction would occur with the same rate to everybody. But note that it is not the long-term advantages that drive this evolution, but mostly the selfish advantage of this strategy. That is, if we consider a population composed of both condition-dependent sex individuals and ones that reproduce sexually at a uniform rate, and they are interbreeding, then what is actually happening is that this subpopulation sends mostly bad alleles and receives all sorts of alleles. And this asymmetrical flow of alleles gives a significant advantage that can drive the evolution of this type of regulation. This would not be enough if it was really bad in the long term, but luckily this strategy is also good in the long term, and particularly in the very long term when adaptation is required. And do we actually see it in the world? So the answer is definitely yes. If we are going to facultatively sexual organisms, we see that indeed many different types of evidence converge to the fact that they reproduce sexually more often when stressed, and they recombine at higher rates when stressed. And we could actually generalize that to many other mechanisms. This is not limited to sexual reproduction, but to any mechanism that regulates the change of the genome. If we think of outcrossing, we can think of a gene that modifies the probability of self-pollination in barley. We could think of mate choice, to pick a mate that is similar to yourself or less similar to yourself. And smell might have a significant role in that in some systems. We can think even, is it a good idea to mutate? Is it a good idea to mutate more often than absolutely necessary. And the same type of model, although more complicated in many cases, can be used in all these systems. And indeed, we get rather consistent result that changes our view of the evolutionary process a little bit. So if the classical view is that the individual is passive in evolution, variation and selection act on it, we can now suggest that the individual has a little bit of effect on its own evolution. It has some effect on how much variation it would produce on, and that would have some long-term implications also for the population as a whole. But in this point, someone usually asks, but what about sex? Okay, we started with this exciting question, and after all, we are not that interested in yeast. I mean, some of us are, but we are more interested in, for example, mammals that reproduce sexually all the time. And it seems that for most of the advantages of sex, even a little bit of sex is enough. This was seen as a really hard question by many different people. And some even think that explaining a little bit of sex is relatively easy in comparison with accounting for the fact that some organisms reproduce only sexually. But the previous works that I presented actually makes this problem harder. It is not only that obligatory sexuals compete with ones that reproduce sexually a little bit. They also compete with ones that reproduce sexually only when stressed. And now we need to give an explanation for why some species would neglect this huge advantage of regulating sexual reproduction and switch into using this very costly mechanism all the time. So in times of trouble, evolutionary theoreticians go back to Darwin. And here, this is a book, The Descent of Man, and Selection in Relation to Sex. This part of the title was lost in translation and does not appear in the Hebrew version. But Darwin was very interested in sexual selection and defined sexual selection as the success of certain individuals over others of the same sex with respect to reproduction, in contrast with natural selection that depends on the success of both sexes in all stages. And I would use males as the ones that compete for the females as the common view, but keep in mind that the things can be exactly the opposite. Basically, the sex that takes care of the offspring is the one that has the option to choose. Females are usually in this condition, but in the cases that males take care of the offspring, then the females compete for the males. So sexual selection includes both extreme cases where individuals, mainly males, have dramatic handicaps like the the neck of the giraffe beetle or the tail of this hummingbird, and includes many more common cases that males compete for females by fighting and courting. In all these examples, it seems that for someone to be really good at sexual selection, it also needs to have a reasonably good genome in other loci, either to succeed in this competition or to survive with its handicap. So why should sexual selection make a difference for the problem of evolution of sex? One reason is that if males that have good genotypes have many offspring, and unsuccessful ones would have really few offspring, then the average fitness of the population would increase. This is really nice, but this doesn't solve our problem. We can describe this problem from the point of view of the female that is feeling really fit and well in this environment. Why should this female mix her genome with someone else? What can be advantageous enough in this generation to do so? Why not produce copies of herself? And if the environment would change, or if she has deleterious mutations, to start reproducing sexually then. And let's have a look again at the classical twofold cost. Here we have a female, a really good female in the population, and it would have on average about 2 offspring, each of them carrying half of her genome. This doesn't look different. If she would have reproduced asexually, she would have 2 offspring exactly identical to herself. But let's see what happens in the next generation if we take sexual selection into account. While having male offspring that are very good, because she herself had a good genome and she was selecting a good male, she can have many more offspring than she would have in the asexual version. So we can see some advantage to reproducing sexually even when her fitness is very high. Through male offspring, grand offspring, and then this advantage can expand in future generations. Does it actually work? So we can construct a model with long genome, with bad and good alleles, and one allele determining the reproduction strategy that can be either obligatory with F, O, or facultative with F. And we'll do very similar to what we've done earlier, but this time before reproduction, we have sexual selection. We can think, for example, of a situation where the female picks the best out of n candidates, where n can be quite significant, as in the case of the garter snakes. And how does this change our results? Quite surprisingly, we see that there is a significant parameter range where mutation rate is high enough and sexual selection is strong enough that obligatory sex can actually evolve in competition with facultative sex and even with reproducing sexually only when stressed. This is completely dependent on sexual selection, and without sexual selection we don't get any such range. We can take things a bit farther and add environmental changes. If the environment changes, and we have here only 2 loci that affect the matching between the individual and the environment, then we can expand the parameter range under which obligatory sex can evolve. So altogether, we have here 2 completely different reasons for individuals to reproduce sexually. The stressed and miserable individuals reproduce sexually because they want to move to a different genetic background. The genes that affect sexual reproduction would benefit from switching to a different background. And the individuals that are feeling well in the population would reproduce sexually because this way they would have more offspring, or at least more grand offspring. So altogether, sexual selection can contribute to the evolution of obligatory sex in the short term and result in increased average fitness in the long term. And in a wider look, we can think of switch from complete asexuality to facultative sex that would happen under almost any conditions. We would expect at least a little bit of sexual reproduction when things are bad. and switch from facultative sex to obligatory sex that requires sexual selection, high mutation rates, and would be helped by environmental changes. So I would like to thank my collaborators on these works and my students that are working on this and related projects. Thank the funding sources, and most importantly,
thank you very much, Lilach. Questions? Well, I have a question. These models take into consideration single mating. When you talk about sexual selection to having an advantage by selecting the best fitted man, it consider a single mating per season. What about multiple mating? So if the female choose or select several males.
you can do it with, you can extend it. This was the simplest option, but you can actually present it as if the males are having a harder time to survive than females, and just going through stronger selection. So some of the males do not survive till reproduction season, and then everybody mate randomly, and it still works.
Yes, yes.
To complicate your model even further, and since you mentioned corals, then in corals we have both sexual and asexual, as you say. But there are corals which are not reproducing asexually, but sexually alone. Those corals can change sex. So you have a combination that one year you're a male and another year you're a female. And how would that go into your models? I don't ask for an answer, but just consider.
So that's an exciting system that I know too little about to respond. I think perhaps we could think of the question of outcrossing in the case of corals. So they might be reproducing sexually all the time, but sometimes they are in fact mating with ones that are farther away, and sometimes with one on the same colony or nearby colony. But
any further question? Oh, thank you. Oh, there's more question. Sorry. There's one more question.
Okay. I wonder, why do you go all the way to evidence like the gene thinks and decide what it should? So we all know about the survival of the fitness and things happen without the gene really thinks and makes a strategy. Well, why do you need to go to all these nice
So, of course, thank you for this comment. If anyone had a doubt, this is only for the presentation, and I by no means intend that genes think, decide, or do anything like that. Genes go through mutation and selection. Some alleles survive better than others. But in most of the talks that I've given, I've found that this view is more intuitive to some people, but don't let that confuse you.
Okay, thank you.